Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we are going to be taking a look at the very first page of the Edit Tuning Setup tab. Now, I'm at Monza, I'm at night, same conditions as I was in last week, also in the BMW M6 GT3, and what I'm actually going to do is load up the default stable setup, and we're going to take a look at that and actually go through all the options here on this first tab, which is the tyres, the brakes and also the chassis. Now quickly, before I dive into all that, some things to note within the various tabs in the Edit Tuning Setup screen is it's divided into three main sections. You've got the stuff here for the left hand side of the car, stuff here for the right hand side of the car, and then we have this center column, which is stuff for either stuff that is found in the center of the car, applies to both the left and also the right hand side of the car, or is more a general thing and doesn't really apply to either. You can find those in the central columns such as the ECU and gearing, and also the differential tab as well. But when you take a look at the dampers and also the suspension, you can see it's split across the three columns according to the layout of the car. Now over here on the right hand side we've got the help text, and that is available for every single adjustable option within the Edit Tuning Setup, and what that'll do is it'll give you an overview as to what that setting is, what happens when you adjust the setting in either direction by either increasing or decreasing the value, and giving you a little bit of an overview and insight. So it's quite useful to refer back to that to kind of refresh your memory as to what it does exactly. But different things and different theories apply across different cars. So it's very much a general thing and applies across the broad spectrum of cars in Project Cars 2. But I'm going to be going into a fair bit more detail than that help text here in these episodes. And finally, at the top here, we've got our option to turn on and off the symmetrical editing of the setup. And what that essentially does is this will be ticked and enabled by default, but essentially stuff that I change on the left hand side of the car, say I'm adjusting here the tyre pressures for the front left, we'll also apply it to the front right as well. If I go and turn off symmetrical editing, I can go ahead and adjust the individual tyres or individual corners or sides of the car independently from the other. Now I'm just going to quickly reset that back to default, so we're back to the default stable setup, and we're now actually going to talk through the various options here on this first screen. And we're going to start off with the tyre compounds. Now generally what you'll have for all cars in the game is essentially a tyre compound for dry weather, a tyre compound for wet weather, a tyre compound for all-terrain, or well, that will be called all-terrain, which is ideal for driving off-road and on the rallycross circuits. And then you'll have a ice tyre compound, which is ideal for heavy snow conditions where you've got snow on the ground on the track and also driving on the ice tracks. Now as you can see here, the first default option, which is very much a convenience sort of thing, is the automatic by weather option. And what that will do is, if you have this selected, is will automatically apply basically the optimal tyre compound for the actual conditions that you're in. If you're driving in the dry, it will probably apply the hard compound tyre to the car. If you're obviously driving in the wet, then it'll apply the wet tyre. If you're at a rallycross circuit, then it'll put the all-terrain tyre on, and then obviously if you're racing in the snow or an ice circuit, it'll put the ice tyre on the car automatically for you. But you can also go ahead and actually choose and specify a specific tyre compound if you so wish. So we've got the all-terrain option there, we've got the ice tyre for this BMW M6, the GT3 cars, we've got the soft slick compound, we have a hard slick compound, and then we have a wet compound. Now generally there's only really one type of wet tyre, unless you go to the road cars, where you'll have a broad spectrum of different tyres available to you. You'll have essentially what is a street tyre, or the type of tyre that we will find on the car if you were to buy it out of the showroom. You'll then probably get like a high performance street tyre, possibly an option for a track day tyre, and then possibly like a full slick compound as well. It depends on the actual road car that you actually choose. The higher performance road cars and the low level track day cars will have a wide variety of different tyres, and obviously the street tyre will work fairly similarly to the street tyres that you'll find on everyday cars, where you'll have grooves, and they'll work in both the dry and also the wet, but obviously won't work as well as say a track day tyre or a full slick tyre in the drier conditions. So there isn't really an intermediate tyre as such, or there certainly isn't for any of the race cars. And then generally what you have for the race cars is a choice between a hard compound and then possibly a soft compound. Some cars will have just the single dry weather compound. Some will have basically a hard slick and a soft slick. Now, there is a difference between the soft slick and the hard slick, and the actual determining factor for which of the two you should choose is all down to the track temperature. This can be found up here in the top right hand corner of the screen, and you can see it indicated there with a little road, the actual track temperature, and then obviously the word track underneath it, and that is actually showing you the track temperature at the time in this race, and it will change dynamically throughout the race as well. It can be found on the pause screens, the pre-race menus, also obviously here in the tuning setup, and also in the in-garage screens in practice and qualifying as well, so you can keep an eye on that. And that is effectively going to be your determining factor as to which of the hard or the soft slick compounds that you are going to end up choosing, especially when it comes to the GT3 cars. So which one should you go for, depending on the numbers here? If the track temperature is between 0 degrees C up to 30 degrees C, you should want to be running on the soft slick compound. Now there's a bit of an overlap here when you come to the hard slick compound, as the hard slick compound will operate in the track temperature window of 25 degrees C through to about 60 degrees C. You only really ever hit that is if you're in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the day, it's nice clear weather, and you're out in the desert such as Dubai or one of the other tracks that gets really hot during the summer. But generally, with the hard slick tyre, that is the tyre that you're going to be racing on 90% of the time. If it drops below 30 degrees C, that's when you want to start considering using the soft slick compound, especially if it's falling out of the window of the hard slick, which is the minimum of 25 degrees C. If it drops below that, get onto the soft slick compound, it'll work better, you'll have more grip there for those track temperature conditions. Now, when it comes to the actual ideal operating temperatures for the actual tyres themselves, again, it's a little bit different here. For the soft slick compounds, you want to be keeping the tyre between the region of 70 degrees C through to about 95 degrees C. If you start going over 95, that's when you'll start to see grip loss, and that is where you'll start to overheat the tyre a fair bit more, especially if you keep trying to push the tyre and it's getting above that temperature. So try and keep the soft slick tyre between that 72 degrees to 95 degrees C window. Obviously, for those who use Fahrenheit, you can do the conversions. Google will do it real quick and easy for you. But yeah, so that is the temperature range that you want to be using for the soft slick, and keeping the tyre within that 70 degrees C to 95 degrees C window. Now the hard tyre will operate within a slightly wider range, and that is from about 70 to 75 degrees C as its minimum, and then up to about 105 degrees C. In some tracks, especially in the really hot conditions, you'll find that you end up going over 105 degrees C, and it can be quite difficult in some of the really high-low corners to try and keep the temperature below that 105. It will go up to about 120 and you'll still get some reasonable levels of grip, but generally when you start overheating above 120, 100, up to 125 and even 130 degrees C, that's when you're going to start seeing really big significant performance drop-offs, and you won't have the tyre grip that you'll have when keeping it within its optimal operating temperature. So those are the various two different compounds and their temperature windows that you want to keep the tyres within. And also a couple of things to note as well is how long the soft slick will last compared to the hard slick. Obviously the soft slick is a softer compound. It provides a little bit, it'll probably provide a little bit more grip if you were to put them side by side within their operating temperature windows, but it also wears a lot quicker than the hard tyre. Generally the soft slick tyre, if you're driving the car properly and you're not abusing the tyres, the soft slick tyre should last you about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes worth of driving. Essentially, it should last a full tank of fuel in the GT3 cars. So that's going from the full fuel tank capacity all the way down to 0 litres. You should be able to do a full fuel stint on the soft slick tyre before you get down to the carcass, providing that you're looking after the tyre properly and not abusing it to hell and back. For the hard slick compounds, they should be able to do double that. So they should be able to do about 2 to 2.5 hours worth of driving and effectively 2 fuel stints before you get down to the carcass. So they'll last longer, but also they provide relatively similar terms of performance as long as they're within their operating windows in terms of the track temperature. So use the track temperature to select which of the 2 tyre compounds that you want to use first. Obviously make sure to maintain the tyres within their operating temperatures as well, and make sure that they aren't overheating. And generally the best way to do that is with the way that you approach and drive the car. If you're chucking the car in through the corners, you'll probably end up sliding, losing grip, which is going to obviously slide the tyre across the surface and generate more heat than it should be, and obviously start to overheat the tyre. You can use tyre pressures a tiny bit, but not anywhere near as you could in the first game. In the first game there was pretty much a direct correlation between tyre pressure and tyre temperature, and you can use tyre pressure to control tyre temperatures. For Project Cars 2, obviously where we've learned a lot more and worked the tyre model to be more accurate and reflect real life, that connection isn't there as much anymore, and now tyre pressures are more separate to tyre temperature. You can do a little bit of temperature control within it, but there's not that direct connection of being able to do it through the tyre pressures. So it's more about the way that you drive and the actual overall setup and handling of the car. Now this obviously leads rather nicely onto the actual tyre pressure section, and as you can see here we have the starting pressures of 1.40 bar, and these are your cold pressures that you're setting here. Now what you want to be doing is actually aiming for a target hot pressure. What I'll do is I'll leave down a link to Casey's post below that I mentioned last week in terms of the operating, or should I say the optimal operating pressures for the various different types of tyres. So make sure to go ahead and check that out, as obviously it applies. He's listed all the various different types of cars and their optimal tyre pressures. But for the GT3 cars, for the majority of tracks, what you should be aiming for is 1.80 bar hot pressure. Now generally with hot pressure you're not going to reach and stabilize that until you're about 5 to 6 laps into a stint or into a race. So when it comes to doing short online or short sprint races that last anywhere between 3 to probably 10 laps, I probably wouldn't bother about actually adjusting tyre pressures and just run with the default. Generally they're quite good and you'll end up near the target pressures, target hot pressures that you want. So only really if you know 100% the conditions that you're going to be racing in for either a career race, or you're doing a longer custom event, or you're doing a league race or something like that, you know what the conditions are going to be in. You're going to be driving on a tyre for a extended period of time. That's when I would actually go ahead and do some fine tyre pressure adjustments. And generally what I'll do is I'll go out on track, do somewhere between the region of 5 to 6 to 10 laps, so 5 or 6 as the minimum, 10 laps being maximum for getting a good idea as to basically the setup changes that I'm making. Take note of the hot tyre pressures in and around those regions, and then adjust these cold pressures here accordingly. For example, if I was driving around here at Monza and I went and did 10 laps, and when I came out of the other side of the 10 laps, I was looking at the telemetry screen and I was seeing that the hot pressure of the tyres was 1.85 bar, I would know that I need to decrease this tyre by turning off the asymmetrical and decreasing it down to 1.35 bar. What that will then mean is next time that I go back out, when I drive around the circuit, it should stabilize at a pressure of 1.8 bar. That's how you go about adjusting tyre pressures. Now this is something that you'll need to do pretty much throughout the entire process of actually creating a tuning setup, as tyres are really important, and they're also basically the various different changes that you make in terms of the downforce, the suspension dampers, and the differential will have an effect on the tyre temperatures and the general handling of the car, which can obviously also affect the actual tyre pressures as well. So these are something that you'll need to be constantly checking and filling and adjusting with as you make various adjustments whilst creating a tuning setup. That is why I say generally for the shorter races it's probably not really worth deviating from the default of 1.40 bar on the default setups and just leaving them as they are, because they come in pretty close in terms of their optimal tyre pressures depending on the track, but also the actual track conditions as well, and your driving will have an influence as to how much your tyre pressures will increase going from these cold pressures up to their hot pressures. Now obviously when you start and go into a race session, you'll have the tyres will be warm. They won't be up to fully optimal temperature, they'll be very close to, and they won't be fully up to pressure, but they'll be very, very close to as well. So you'll need to keep that in mind. But when you're doing your tyre pressure testing here, make sure that you're adjusting the tyre pressures throughout the process of adjusting your car setup, and make sure that you're consistently hitting that optimal tyre pressure, optimal hot tyre pressure, shall I say, sorry, when doing your testing. Now obviously the actual tyre pressures, what you want to be aiming for is obviously that hot pressure, but with that as well you can also manipulate it for certain tracks, as Casey's post suggests. So some of the tighter and more twistier circuits you can get away with aiming for slightly below 1.80 bar, and what they'll do is they'll give you a tiny little bit more grip, but also obviously provide more rolling resistance, so you'll be a little bit slower down the straights. For tracks like Monza and Le Mans, you can actually go above 1.80 bar, and that will give you less rolling resistance, which will help improve top speed a little bit, but obviously it will be detrimental to your cornering performance. So it's a little bit of a fine balancing act depending on the actual track that you're on. For here at Monza, I believe when I did a league race, I had my tyre pressures, I was aiming for about 1.85 bar as a stable hot pressure, so I wasn't deviating too much from the optimal pressure, but it was providing less rolling resistance without losing too much cornering performance either. When you're at the optimal tyre pressure or hot tyre pressure, what you'll get is basically the perfect balance between, or what is a really nice balance between rolling resistance, or should I say not having too much rolling resistance, having good tyre grip, and also actually having not having too much tyre wear and getting good tyre life out of it. The softer the tyre, or should I say the lower the tyre pressure, generally the more the tyre pressure will roll and fold over the surface of the track, and actually the bigger the contact patch that you'll have, and generally that will increase the tyre wear in the tyre. Whereas if you pump the tyres up a little bit more and have a higher tyre pressure, you'll have effectively less surface contact under normal conditions. Obviously if you then go and adjust the camber, you can alter those the size of the contact patches, but generally what you have is slightly less tyre wear, providing that you haven't pumped the tyres up so much that there's no bite coming from the tyres and they're sliding across the surface. So it's very much a balancing act when it comes to tyre pressures, but as long as you're very, very close to the optimal hot pressures, you should be fine. So it's only really for the longer races that you'll really need to worry about tyre pressures too much. So generally for those shorter races, keep it at default, but if you know the track conditions that you're going to be racing in, and you're going to be doing a longer race, either career, a custom event, or possibly an online like league race or community race or something like that, take a look at your tyre pressures and make sure you try and hit the optimal tyre pressure for each of the four corners of the car. Now though, we are going to take a look at this central column here, and the first thing that we're going to take a look at is brake pressure. Now generally for the stable setups, what you'll find is this is set to 93%. If you increase this, you'll probably get better performing brakes, in the sense that you can brake harder and it will slow you down more, but also it will increase your chances of locking up. And as it says in the help text description, if you were to lower the brake pressure, you're less likely to lock up, but what it could also lead to is the car reaching its full braking potential earlier. And what it means by that, in the slightly negative sense, is if you lower the brake pressure, it's easier to get to its full braking performance potential. But with that is, if you reach that and it's not quite high enough, the brakes with a higher brake pressure could perform better if you were able to brake effectively, and it'll slow the car down more. If that makes sense. I probably explained it quite badly, but essentially, if you lower the brake pressure, you're more likely to basically get hard on the brakes, and you probably won't have the performance that you would have at a higher pressure. So generally it's kind of, again, like a balancing act of going with a high pressure to get good effective brakes, but obviously not having it so high that you lock up every single time that you get on the brake, and you lock the tyres really easily. So generally what I tend to aim for is a brake pressure of the default 93. I don't really go any higher than this, and I'll probably go down to maybe 88 if I'm really struggling with the brakes for whichever reason. But generally 92, 93% is where I have it for 99% of the time when it comes to brake pressure. When it comes to brake balance, having it further forward is a lot safer. It'll mean that you'll get a little bit of understeer if you trail brake into the corners. So if you do prefer trail braking, I'd advise moving this backwards. And like I covered in the baseline setup, generally what I like to have is in and around about 58 brake bias, with 58% to the front and 42% on the rear. But it's very much a personal sort of thing. With the brake bias further forwards, you'll be more stable under braking. You're less likely to lock up the rears and less likely to over rotate and oversteer going into a corner, especially if you're trail braking that a little bit. But also it makes it easier to lock up the fronts, and you'll understeer if you lock up the fronts as well. So find that balance between what feels right for you when it comes to the actual brake balance. Personally for me, as you can see there, it's 58 to 42% that I like here at the rear. I'm just going to quickly turn that on and actually go ahead and put those back to the default as well. Now, brake duct openings. These are very much for controlling how much airflow gets into the brake ducts and how much you want to cool the brakes. And as I touched on the previous 2 episodes, you can adjust these to run within their basically the optimal temperature ranges of the brakes. Now for the GT3 cars with the steel brakes, you want to be running between 300 degrees C through to about 650 to maybe 700 degrees C at its very maximum. What that should mean is that in basically the hardest braking zone on the track, you don't want to be peaking above 650 to 700 degrees C. But on the straights, you don't want to be dropping below 300 degrees C. That's where you'll find optimal braking performance. And when you jump on the brakes, you'll get really good bite initially, and they'll continue through the braking zone as well. But it won't overheat and you won't get brake fade, providing you keep it under that 650 to 700 degrees value mark. So with that in mind, what you'll want to do is basically close up the brake ducts, or possibly even open them to keep them within that window. Now, generally the front brake duct is going to be larger than the rear. The front brakes will cool quicker than the rear brakes will cool, just naturally with the layout and where the duct intakes are positioned on the car. So generally what you'll have is a higher front duct opening than you will have at the rear. And like I said, in the baseline setup, you can drop the rear brake duct down a little bit to about 65% as a baseline, and then depending on the track conditions, you can actually drop this down a lot further. I think the lowest that I've ever run my brake ducts was down about, I think it was about 10-15% on the rear and probably about 30-35% on the front. That was basically I think it was cool conditions similar to these at Monza, where obviously going down the straights, the brakes were getting quite a bit of cooling into them. Obviously closing up also helped with the straight line performance as there's less drag, but basically I was able to maintain the brakes within their optimal temperature ranges. When it comes to the higher performance cars that use carbon ceramic brakes, you want to be keeping the brake temperatures in and around the range of about 600 degrees C up to about 1200-ish, I think, off the top of my head. I haven't driven any cars with carbon ceramic brakes in a while. Generally what you'll find is you'll find that on like the LMP1 cars, possibly LMP2s. The Formula A and the Formula X cars also have carbon ceramic brakes, and also some of the really high performance road cars and track day cars as well. They'll operate at a higher brake temperature, and generally what you want to do is try and keep them in and around those roughly around the 800 to 1000 degrees C mark. Works really nicely for those brakes. So those are the targets that you want to be aiming for, and obviously adjusting your brake duct openings based on that. Now, coming down to the downforce section, and this is very important, and something that people get wrong quite consistently. Generally what people think they should be doing is running the lowest wings that they possibly can and try and obviously maximizing the straight line performance, when actually having downforce actually helps. And people also get it a little bit wrong, where they'll say have, obviously here for the default, it starts off with 0 wing, with a front split I can raise up to an angle of 2 on the BMW M6 GT3. Not all GT3 cars have a front downforce value that you can adjust, and it's only the rear downforce. But what some people will do for, say, high downforce tracks is put a lot of downforce in the front and then have a really low wing angle on the rear for the straights. And what you're doing there is completely throwing off the aero balance of the car. And what I mean by that is essentially you'll be generating a lot of downforce in the front, but not a lot of downforce on the rear, which means that when you go into a corner where you've got a lot of aero grip on the front of the car, you turn into the corner and you'll get a lot of really good initial bite, but then all of a sudden the rear end will just completely oversteer on you, and it'll just swing around and try and overtake you. And that's because you don't have the downforce on the rear tyres to match or cope with the amount of grip that the front tyres are providing. So what you need to do is actually maintain aero balance across the car. Now, generally, it's a little bit difficult to explain, because the cars, depending on the shape of the car and how effective their aero parts are, and there's no real obvious way of seeing this other than actually going out on track and testing. Basically, there's various different ranges that you can use in terms of aero balance from front to rear on various different cars. What I generally tend to do is follow this sort of formatting window with the GT3 cars. So if I'm running on a track such as Monza, I'll have the front downforce at 0 because I need that straight line speed. But if I have the front downforce at 0, what I need to be doing is making sure that I don't put too much rear downforce on, or don't take too much off. If I take too much off when it comes into the high speed corners, the rear end won't have any grip and it'll just oversteer on the high speed corners where I don't have any aero grip. But if I put too much on, there'll be too much grip on the rear, and there'll be too much downforce, and it'll be lifting the front, and the front will actually get understeer. So I need to maintain some kind of balance, and what I'll do is I'll operate within various basically downforce value windows. So if I have 0 on the front, generally what I'll operate between is a minimum of 2 up to about 5, maybe 6. The default is 6 on the BMW M6 GT3 with a stable setup, so I probably recommend dropping that down to 5. It'll still provide you with good grip, but also actually provide you with decent aero balance. But basically I'll keep that range when I'm using downforce value of 0. If I was to use, obviously, to go on a track with what would be considered medium downforce, so I have quite a few high speed to medium speed corners where the aero grip is needed, but there's also quite a couple of reasonably long straights where I want some decent high speed performance. I'll put the front downforce value at 1, and then I'll have the rear downforce value between either 4 to probably 6. Generally, depending on how the car feels in terms of the conditions and how much the rear is oversteering a little bit, and whether the rear can actually keep up, rear tyres can actually keep up with the grip being provided at the front with the downforce, I'll run the rear wing between the values of 4 and 6. Now, for high downforce tracks, or tracks that are really twisty, such as Laguna Seca was the last place that I ran, with a front downforce wing of 2, which is the maximum on the M6 GT3. I'll have the rear downforce between a minimum value of 6 and then the maximum setting, which is 8. So within those windows, depending on the front downforce angle, I'll use the various different rear downforce angles in order to basically make sure that I maintain aero balance across the car, and it keeps the car relatively neutral, and I'm not going to effectively take too much off the rear or put too much onto the rear that one or either end of the car can't cope with the amount of aero grip that is being produced on the other side. So that is generally what I tend to do across the GT3 cars. If the that is obviously providing that the actual car allows you to adjust the front downforce. I know there's some cars that don't allow it. I believe the Lamborghini Huracan, for example, doesn't allow you to adjust the front downforce, and instead only allows you to adjust the rear downforce. And then obviously with that, what you want to do is actually make sure that you're not putting too much rear downforce on the rear of the car for tracks that require higher downforce settings, as that will essentially take away aero grip from the front of the car, and it'll make it understeer a little bit more. So you'll need to find that balance essentially. It entirely depends on what the car actually allows you to do. But as I said, as a summary, if you've got the front downforce at 0, run between 5 to 2 on the rear. If you've got 1 on the front, run between 4 to 6. And if I've got 2 on the rear, I'll run between 6 and 8, and that will maintain good aero balance from front to rear in terms of the downforce. Now, longitudinal weight bias, this is basically shifting the weight bias either forwards or backwards, and as you can see, it's neutral for the BMW M6 GT3 with a 50-50, but obviously the actual layout of the car in terms of the positioning of the engine, the gearbox and differentials and things like that will have an influence on the overall weight and where you'll want to shift the actual longitudinal weight bias depending on the track and also the conditions. As you can see from the help text, moving the weight either forwards or rearwards will adjust the balance of the car, and generally what I will tend to do with the BMW M6 GT3, where the weight is mostly at the front of the car because of the engine being situated at the front, is I'll move it rearwards to a value of 49 to 51, which is also the furthest, or yeah, the furthest I can shift the weight bias towards the rear. I can move the weight bias further to the front if I wanted to 52 to 4.8, but generally I either keep it at 50-50 or I put it at 49.0. It's very useful in the wet conditions where it will allow you to get a decent amount of grip from the front, and also there'll be a little bit more weight on the rear, which means they'll provide slightly better traction as well. With obviously rear engine cars, you may want to move the longitudinal weight bias forwards a little bit more. For mid-engine cars, you want to keep it relatively stable, but essentially what you want from it is a nice neutral balance in terms of the car, and it's not oversteering or understeering too much either. Now, when it comes to lateral weight bias, it isn't an option that you can change in the GT3 cars, and essentially what it is you can shift the weight of the car to either to the left or the right hand side, and then you've got a weight jacker option, which is mainly for the NASCAR cars and possibly some of the off-road cars as well, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it does exactly, so I'll actually pick up on that on the next episode. Quickly pop that in at the start after reading the help text, but the help text does a pretty good explanation of what that does, but generally it's not an option that you'll find commonly on most cars, which is why they're greyed out and aren't adjustable here. So hopefully that's gone and helped you provide with a number of various pieces of useful information to take away on this first tab of the tuning setup. Obviously different car types prefer slightly different settings, so you may need to play around a little bit in order to find the optimal performance for each of the cars, but hopefully that information should give you a little bit more insight as to how these various settings work, what sort of ranges and settings that or values that you should be aiming for, and hopefully it'll provide you a little bit more confidence when it goes out in terms of testing and fiddling with setups. and the knowledge to actually go ahead and start creating and changing a couple of things here on this first tab when creating your own setups. Obviously, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave those down in the comment section below. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode, but other than that, thank you very much for watching. Feel free to subscribe to the channel, like, share, all that good stuff, and hopefully I shall see you in the next episode next week. But other than that, thanks very much for watching. In the meantime, take care.